Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today for this presentation. So today we're going to be talking about social emotional learning, but specifically I broke this presentation down, or I plan to break it down into several different parts. So today is just part one, which is really just going to be an introduction, kind of more or less describing what is SEL, why is it important, and beginning to explore the framework behind social emotional learning. So before I start, I just want to give a quick introduction. My name is Amanda Gonzalez, and I'm a school psychologist. I've been working now for 8 years as a school psychologist in my district. I work at an elementary school, so grades K through 5. I also, prior to becoming a school psychologist, I was in school to become a classroom teacher. So I do have a certification and I'm a certified teacher in grades K through 6. While I never formally taught in my own classroom, I do have experience student teaching and working in classrooms for 2 years while I was pursuing my master's degree in elementary ed. And I have to say that for me, I think that that was probably one of the best decisions I ever made while I was, in my training to become a classroom teacher. That's how I sort of discovered and learned about school psychology, and that's really what drew my interest and my passion. So crazily enough, after I graduated with my master's in education, I immediately jumped right back into grad school and pursued my master's in 6th year in school psychology. But I think that having that foundation and that background knowledge of education and taking on the role of a classroom teacher, during my student teaching and working with educators and subbing in classrooms for teachers, it really gave me kind of a unique lens and a really helpful perspective in terms of what our teachers go through on a day-to-day basis. And I just commend all educators out there because you guys do so much for your students, and the amount of work that goes into planning for your students and the hours spent not within, outside of the traditional school day setting is just beyond. And I don't think others that are not familiar with education, I don't think they really truly appreciate and understand the amount of work that educators spend in preparation for just one day alone for their students. So I just wanted to share a little bit of my background, and let's dive into the presentation. So today's presentation is all based off of this book. This is an amazing resource that I came across on Amazon, and it's called SEL From A Distance, Tools and Processes for Anytime, Anywhere, and it was written by Jessica and John Hannigan. And I started reading this book, and immediately as soon as I started reading it, I just honestly, I fell in love with this book because the authors, they explain social emotional learning, they break it down in such an easy to understand way, and they highlight the importance behind why SEL matters. And I mean, I just couldn't say enough good things about this book. So this whole presentation is based off of this book. Just a side note, I have no affiliation with the authors. They've never heard of me. They don't know who I am. I just created this presentation because I truly love this book and I love everything that it's about. And I was hoping that maybe if I did this presentation, I could help spread awareness about this book, about SEL and its importance. So again, I purchased mine on Amazon. It was relatively inexpensive, and this is going to be a fantastic book, especially for those of you who are maybe teaching right now remote or digital, for students who are participating in online learning rather than in-person learning. In my district, we have a mix. I work in the elementary school setting, so most of my students are in person, but I do have a few students who are participating in distance learning this year, just with everything happening from the pandemic and all of that. So this book, I think, is really helpful for those teachers, but I do want to highlight the fact that it's not just for teachers teaching remote or teaching online. This is a fantastic resource that is going to help any educator, whether you're in person or virtual. This really is a fantastic book. So the outline of today's presentation is broken into 3 separate parts. So we're going to focus on why does SEL matter, what is SEL, and just start to dive into the framework behind social emotional learning. So the authors in the book, they talk a lot, in the beginning of the book, they talk a lot about how, social emotional learning, it's always been important, but I don't think it really got recognized as a significant area of need until we really found ourselves in the pandemic this past year related to COVID-19. And I think that when we saw all of our schools, speaking here within the United States, when we saw all of our schools shutting down and closing and moving to remote learning and online learning, I think it really threw us all for a loop, and we never expected that to happen. And there was many challenges that we encountered when that happened. And for my district, I'll never forget. We probably went into distance learning. I think for us it was probably sometime around March, kind of early mid March that it happened. And initially, school was closed for 2 days just so that they could do some deep cleaning. And then we were told to bring any materials that we might need because we might be starting for a few days with doing distance learning. And then it turned into a couple of weeks, and then before we knew it, we found out that the remainder of the year would be virtual learning versus in person. So there was a lot of things that came with that, right? And of course, I think throughout the pandemic, we really saw an increase in terms of really seeing firsthand emotions related to depression, anxiety, stress, and how that was affecting not just adults, but really affecting children, teenagers, young adults, elementary school students. So, really, kind of this book was sort of written with that in mind and recognizing that SEL is so, so important. So, really, social emotional learning, it's the intentional teaching and designing of your classroom environment, and it's really helping to create the basis or the foundation for creating a healthy environment for students practicing real life skills that they're going to need in a day-to-day everyday living, helping them to build their capacity so that as they progress through elementary school, middle school, high school, into the workforce, our students have those basic foundational skills that they need to be successful, not just academically, but in life in general. The book does a really great job of talking a lot about the statistics, and I think it's important that we recognize how prevalent some, mental health diagnoses really are for our young learners, our students. And the book, it talks about startling statistics pre-pandemic and then statistics post-pandemic. So already pre-pandemic, before COVID-19 and kind of the global impact of that, we already had students that were really struggling. 1 in 5 children were experiencing some form of mental health challenges, whether it was a diagnosis. We've seen, at least for myself, I can attest to this, there was a significant increase in terms of diagnoses related to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADD, ADHD. Students among ages 10 to 14, there was an increase in suicide rates among that age range, and over 60% of students have experienced some form of trauma, whether it was vicarious trauma, witnessing trauma in the home related to maybe domestic violence or domestic abuse, or some form of abuse directed towards them. And then post-pandemic, so since the pandemic, we've certainly seen a rise in terms of anxiety, depression, stress level, truancy. I think especially for those of us, if we had students that were really struggling in person learning to return their homework and assignments, then I think that we definitely have seen an increase of that with students participating in digital or remote learning from their home. Our absenteeism is probably higher than in past, globally, it's probably higher than in past years. And getting students to be engaged within their virtual learning, log into classrooms, complete their assignments, be participants in their learning. I think that we probably have globally seen a decline in that. So some way or another, most of our students have experienced some form of mental health crisis in response to this pandemic that we've found ourselves in. The book does a really great job of talking about the benefits of SEL, and they give like a really great comprehensive list of some of the benefits, and I just picked a couple and inserted them here on this slide just to kind of show some of the benefits that you get from SEL. But again, if you purchase the book, you'll see tons of other benefits that you get too. But overall, SEL, if you really practice it and make this a daily part of your classroom kind of philosophy, you're going to see an increase in student engagement. You'll see an improvement in their mental health and their resiliency skills and their ability to adapt and overcome to challenges that they face. You're going to see an increase in pro-social behaviors and hopefully a decrease in maladaptive behaviors. They're going to be more engaged. Their social skills will be improved. Their stress levels will decrease ideally. So those are just a couple of the benefits of SEL. So moving into part 2 of the presentation, what is SEL, helping us to better understand it. So SEL as a construct overall is the idea of helping our learners understand the relationship between their emotions and their behaviors. So basically, through social emotional learning, we're helping our students to understand what is self-regulation, helping them understand, their own well-being and how to manage and regulate their mood, identify what do they need, and that in turn, this is going to help them be more engaged and improve academic achievement over the course of time. Within the book, the authors define SEL as social emotional learning that is going to enhance our students' capacity to integrate these skills and improve their attitude and their behavior so that they can effectively handle anything that they might be dealing with in terms of challenges or obstacles that they face on a day-to-day basis. The authors talk a lot in the book about CASEL, so I'm sure this is pretty well known among I think educators or those who work to some capacity in mental health in the school setting, school psychologists, social workers, school counselors, things like that, or professions like that. But there's the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. And CASEL developed 5 what they call core SEL competencies. So the authors talk about those 5 competencies, and they provide examples of kind of what falls underneath each of those categories. So there's relationship skills, responsible decision making, social awareness, self-management, self-awareness, and some of the factors or areas that fall under that, for relationship skills, we have communication, teamwork. Responsible decision making is helping our students to identify problems, evaluate problems that they might have. Social awareness is helping to improve students' ability related to perspective taking. So think empathy, teaching our students what does it mean to be empathetic, what does it mean to be compassionate, and to being caring towards others. Self-management is when we think like impulse control and you think inhibition, stopping yourself from engaging in impulsive actions, thinking about self-motivation skills, thinking about organizational skills, planning skills, so kind of thinking executive functioning overall. And then self-awareness is helping our students to recognize and identify, name an emotion, helping them to understand the intensity of that emotion, building their self-efficacy skills. So those are just a couple of the areas that fall under those categories. So then the authors talk about behaviors and skills. So basically, when you're thinking, if you're a classroom teacher or someone who works in a classroom or a teaching setting, one thing that you really want to do is you want to try to pinpoint what is the challenging behavior that that student is displaying. So when we're thinking of students that have challenging behaviors, we need to kind of dig a little deeper, analyze a little deeper, ask ourselves, what skill is the student lacking? And when we can come up with that question and we come up with an answer, now we're at a start point for coming up with an effective intervention that we can use to help target that skill that the student needs more support in. This is a chart that the authors provide in the book, and I love this chart. I thought it was such a fantastic, easy explanation and breakdown. And if you purchase the book, they give lots of really helpful examples for those who sometimes, when you're trying to start an intervention or pinpoint like a starting point, sometimes it gets really overwhelming because you just don't really know where do I start. And sometimes that can be half the battle, right, to beginning any intervention and ensuring success with that strategy that you're working on. So I think if you purchase the book, this is a really helpful chart that will help you to kind of pinpoint your starting point of where you need to begin when focusing on an intervention with a student. So there's 2 columns. You have the what are the challenging student behaviors you're seeing, and then the second column is where you write what's the SEL skill that the student is lacking. So thinking, what do they need to be taught, what needs to be modeled to the student so that they disengage in that maladaptive behavior. So one example the authors provide is shutting down, and the lacking skill that the student does not yet have is how to identify that emotion or identify their emotions. And again, the book gives a more comprehensive example of other areas that would fall under those 2 categories. So the third section for today's presentation is talking a little bit about the framework behind SEL, so understanding the social emotional learning competencies and implementing the framework. And again, the authors provide a really helpful visual. So please, I definitely suggest going online and looking up this book, purchasing it if you're able to, because there's so many helpful visuals and breakdowns and examples that the authors provide in depth. So the authors talk about SEL implementation, and they break it down into 3 separate phases. You have phase 1, and again, the order of these stages are important. So you can't necessarily shift them out of order, because you need to go through phase 1, phase 2 in order to get to phase 3. So phase 1 is prioritize, phase 2 is considered the mastery phase, and phase 3 is the SEL teaching process. So the framework behind sort of the breakdown of all the stages is that phase 1, this is really looking at the SEL competencies. So when you think about the five areas or 5 competencies related to the areas that CASEL describes, and I also included, there's a website for CASEL that you can go to that has tons of resources, and they provide really helpful visuals of the 5 core competencies for SEL. But phase 1 is prioritizing those competencies and trying to better understand what is the focus. So this is where you use your data that you're collecting on the student. This is where you sit down as a team and you talk, and you have students, teachers, educators, or those adults working with the student complete sort of like a little, not necessarily a questionnaire, but a rating scale or rating form, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Phase 2 is considered the mastery phase, and this is where the authors provide a really helpful rubric that is so easy to use, and the rubric breaks it down into 3 different levels of mastery, and this is important because it's going to help you as the team working with the student better identify and determine what's the area of focus and what area is the student already demonstrating proficient or independent skills in. Phase 3 is the teaching process, and the authors break the teaching process into separate components. So they rate it or break it down into identifying, teaching, modeling, and reinforcing the skill. So phase 1, prioritize. The authors have a really great rating scale that I think is so helpful, and if you purchase the book, it has an example of the rating form, and it's something that's really easy to kind of recreate on your own. But this is really important because the SEL Competency Priority Forced Rating Scale, as it's called in the book, is a scale that you have any team member that's working with the student would complete it. So the classroom teacher, the specialist teachers, so thinking like media, MLT, music, art, gym, those teachers. If there's a special education teacher, they would complete it. Maybe administrators that are really involved with the student might want to complete it. But this rating scale is really important because it basically is going to help the team figure out the starting point of an intervention in terms of what core competency is the student really struggling in, and this will help you then determine what should be the area of focus. So the way that the rating form works is each rater, each individual that works with the student, would rate the student on a scale of 1 to 5, so thinking 1 through 5 competencies, and they rate the competencies in terms of highest priority and lowest priority. So basically for each competency, they assign a score of 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest number, meaning that that's the area that the student in their eyes is struggling the most, and 5 would be the area that the student is demonstrating sufficient skills in. So from there, the forms are then collected and you would tally the totals, and then you have your answer in terms of the SEL competency that has the lowest ranking score is then considered the highest area of need, so the priority area that you want to focus on. Phase 2, this is considered the mastery phase, and using the rating scale form from the previous slide, now you basically have an idea of what competency is that child sufficient in or proficient in, what have they mastered. And the authors break it down. They provide a really helpful rubric form, and in the form they break it down in terms of there's internalized mastery. This suggests that the student has mastered that competency, they're sufficient in it, they're independent in that skill. Emergent mastery is suggesting that the student, they're proficient in this area. They might need a prompt or a cue, but they're able to do it when they need to. And then minimal to no mastery is exactly that. That would be the lowest ranking competency on that rating form. This is the area that the students are really struggling in. They're not consistent. They need direct and explicit teaching in that area. And then moving to phase 3, this is the teaching process for SEL. And in this phase, the team really needs to work effectively. They need to collaborate. They need to design and implement the tools that that the student is going to need in order to achieve success related to that strategy or skill that you're teaching them. And the authors came up with a really great framework or template for this. And again, if you purchase the book, you'll see a really great visual that kind of gives the outline for this template. And basically you have identify, so using your data that you've been collecting either school-wide or classroom, within the classroom, to determine what's the area of need. Then you move into the teaching phase, which is exactly that, teaching the child the skill directly. And this needs to occur by all adults, and it needs to be on a daily basis because, again, consistency is key. And I think we can all probably agree that consistency sometimes is the breakdown of sometimes why interventions are not working. Then you move into the modeling stage, which is all adults or educators working with a student make a point to model that skill to the student, and then reinforce. So reinforcing the skills that are being taught. And I love this visual. The authors talk again about the 5 core competencies as it pertains to social emotional learning, and they provide a deconstructed skill that falls within those competencies or stages. So I think the chart, and again, I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but if you purchase the book, they provide a really helpful chart that has quite a few deconstructed skills, and I just picked one from each for the purpose of the presentation just to give an example. But the authors provide this example, and this chart is really helpful because then if you, again, go back to the rating form that the teachers complete and then rating the mastery level, then this is going to be important to help you identify what's the skill that the student is needing. So for example, relationship skills, a deconstructed skill might be communication. So then from there you might target building the student's ability to communicate their emotions or what do they need. So maybe the focus of the intervention would be having the student use an iMessage when they get upset, or using an iMessage to communicate to a peer about their needs or their wants in that moment. Responsible decision making, one example of a deconstructed skill would be identifying problems. Social awareness, an example would be perspective taking. So maybe if the student is very egocentric, and for the older students that they only view sort of the world through their own eyes, then maybe an intervention would be working on perspective taking. So maybe support staff, the social worker, school psychologist, or school counselor would then target that skill with the student in terms of doing things like bibliotherapy, reading books to the child, having them practice taking perspective of the characters, and teaching them what does perspective taking mean, giving the student a pre-test, teaching the skill, and then giving them a post-test to measure student progress. And then from perspective taking, now the classroom teachers are also teaching this skill. Those specialist teachers that work with the student are teaching the skill, and then the team is communicating and collaborating with the families and giving the families the strategies to help the student take perspective and practice using this skill. Self-management, an example would be impulse control. So maybe you're focusing on helping the student control impulses, and that would be your main focus or your intervention. And for 6 to 8 weeks, you're using a strategy to build the student's capacity to inhibit those impulses. Self-awareness, identifying emotions. So maybe a student is struggling with naming their feelings, so that would be then the intervention or the focus area. So all parties involved would make sure make a point to help teach the child how to name their feelings, name their emotions, name the intensity of their emotions, and again, you would collaborate and communicate, and resources would be shared out with all members involved, including families. One thing I love that the authors do in the book is they talk about the pitfalls or the gaps for why sometimes our interventions are not working, or we're not seeing effective growth in those initiatives that we're trying with our students. And I think that this is important, and I included this in the presentation because I'm huge on reflecting, and I talk to my students all the time about the power of reflection, and how sometimes if we take a minute to stop and think about our day, our week, our month, or past couple months, and we think about things that maybe haven't worked out or things that came up, we can use that to better figure out what do we need to do different moving forward. And so I think it's really important for all members of the team to kind of reflect and think about how are they contributing to that intervention with the student. Are they contributing enough? Are they taking ownership and participating effectively within the intervention? And if not, then what do they need to change so that they can be a better participant in helping this child become successful with the competency that we're trying to build or increase in our students? And it goes without saying, and I think we can all agree, for any intervention to truly, truly, truly be effective, all parties need to work together. Teamwork is so important. So the authors give, I believe it's 5 kind of pitfalls or gaps in terms of why the interventions are not successful. The first one they talk about is the lack of communication. Again, consistent dialogue on a daily basis is going to be so important. So communicating with the family members, communicating with outside agencies, talking about what you're seeing, what you're doing, what intervention are you working with the student on in the school, but also giving them the means and the resources so then they can replicate it in those other areas too, because it goes beyond just the 4 walls of the classroom, but it goes within the school, the community of the school. It goes within the community outside of the school, helping the parents within the home build the child's capacity. The outside agencies working with the child, if they have a therapist outside of school, communicate, get a release of information to talk to that professional. They might have insight that you don't yet know about, and they can give you strategies just as you can give them strategies. So now you're generalizing the skill beyond the classroom. Another one is a lack of collaboration. Again, teamwork. So it's important that all parties work together. Again, going back to staff members, families, and outside agencies. Coordination is so important. Aligning your resources. If you are a school psychologist or school social worker or school counselor, someone who is working with a student tirelessly on a skill and you're developing resources, visuals for that student, it shouldn't just start and end within your office or your classroom that you work with the student in, but it should be shared throughout. So share your resources. And I'm huge in this. I work with some students right now. I'm working with students to really build executive functioning. And I love visuals, so I love creating visuals and resources for my students, but I do make a point to share those resources out. And even though sometimes it does take extra time and work, and it's extra effort to go out of your way to sometimes print the resources, because obviously sometimes when they're in color, it's so much better than when it's black and white. So I try to make a point to print resources that I'm working with the students on, like little visual strips or whatever it might be. I'll put them out in color. I'll cut them out. I take the time to laminate them. I deliver them to the classroom teachers or the special education teachers, and I show them what we're working on. I show them how I'm using it with the student. I make a copy for the student. Sometimes I'll tape it to the student's desk. The teacher will then reinforce the strategy with the student, and I make a point to share it with the families as well. So I'll make extra copies and I'll send them home with the families, with the student, and then I take the time to call the family members and I'll go through it and I'll explain it. And it's just coordinating our resources. You're spending so much time and putting in so much effort to create that resource or material for the child. Why not share it out for everyone? And that's going to help the student even more to generalize the skill and build their capacity. Also, lack of capacity building. So it's really important that all members involved are willing to work together, but more important that they're willing to learn together. So attend workshops, attend trainings, share out resources, maybe buy the books if you're able to, and do like a little book club with your staff members and read the activity. Have maybe weekly or monthly meetings where you sit and talk about, what you learned, and do some trainings. That's so important because not one person is all knowing. I promise you that. I don't have all the answers. And, I think that it's so important that we collaborate with one another because I'm always learning from other professionals in my building. I'm always learning from the special education teachers or the classroom teachers or our BCBA that works in our district. And they help teach me new things that maybe I didn't know or give me a different lens, a different perspective to look at something in a different way and come up with an alternate strategy to help our students or help our learners or families. So learning is a huge part, and we should always try to stay active with professional development and on our own and as a team. Another area is lack of collective ownership, and I do think that this is a huge part in terms of why sometimes interventions are not successful. When we're implementing an intervention for our students, it's so important that all team members have equal responsibility. No one person is more responsible than the next. We all need to take equal ownership, equal responsibility to ensure the success of our learners. That includes not just the classroom teacher or support staff, outside of just support staff with, school psychs and social workers and counselors, but support staff including the paraprofessionals that work with the student, any individual basically that is working with that student on a day-to-day basis, including the student themselves. They also need to take ownership, but also the family members. It's, an intervention is not going to be successful if it's only happening within the school day, the school setting. The family members also need to take some ownership and be a part of the intervention. And what we're doing in the school, they should try to replicate within the home setting as well. So I know that this was kind of a quick introduction and a quick presentation, but that is it for today. So thank you so much to those of you who joined me for this presentation, who sat and listened throughout the entire presentation. I really, really appreciate it. It means so, so much to me. And if you can't tell yet, SEL is something that I'm so, so passionate about. I love social emotional learning. I truly live and breathe it and believe in it. I would love if you follow me on Instagram at School Psych Amanda G. I also have a Teacher Pay Teacher store. It's also called School Psych Amanda G. And if you're watching this, and obviously you know about my YouTube channel, School Psych Amanda G as well. But I do appreciate your support and watching this presentation. It does really mean a lot to me, and I love when I receive feedback and comments. And for those of you who reach out to me on Instagram, and we've had some really fantastic dialogue between each other, conversations, and I just find it so exciting when I get to connect with someone new. So I would love if you followed me on those platforms. It would mean so much to me. And again, thank you so much. And just kind of some housekeeping in terms of use. You're free to use this resource as for your own educational growth, or for like your team's educational growth and learning about social emotional learning and kind of planning. But I ask that you do not post or alter this presentation in any way. Again, this presentation has no affiliation to the authors. I did this on my own because I love this book, and I just wanted to spread awareness about the book and help share out some of the information that I learned. And this book has already taught me so much. And of course, I also included the resources for some of the information and pictures that you see throughout the presentation here. But thank you guys so much for watching this presentation. It really does mean so much to me. I appreciate you taking the time to sit and watch it. Please, please reach out to me. Let's connect. Let's communicate with one another. I'd be so grateful to establish some new connections with others. And it's so exciting when I get to connect with individuals, across throughout the United States and even across the globe. I've met some amazing people from Spain, from Australia, literally all over, and it's been so exciting. So thank you guys again. I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care, and be on the lookout for presentation number 2 coming soon, hopefully. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, everyone.